before we start talking about joy, it's probably fair to admit that some people have got very critical over in recent years. I'm a bit concerned about that because, we've got a saying in English, which is people who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. And basically what that means, Juliet, is that none of us gets everything right all of the time. And what people who throw stones from their glass houses at other people are really doing is emphasizing they've got things wrong, but they don't want to talk about them. They're trying to distract by attacking somebody else. And I think the best thing we can do with anybody, and that includes Joy Baker, is look at what they did right, acknowledge what they did wrong, but learn from what they did right. And that is what I think we need to do. And there was some similarities for Joy to what's happening today, but there's also some differences. Briefly, the similarities are that on the ground, she was battling local authority employees who believed every child should be in school. They didn't embrace what the law said then, but the law was pretty simple then. And it was straightforward. We all know it well in home education circles that essentially home education is a valid option, alternative option to school. And that was respected by some people, by the courts in particular, but local authority officials, most of them had probably been taught in schools, worked in schools, and were now working for the LA about schools, had this notion that parents aren't professionals and that children need to be in school to learn. And that situation's got far more complicated now. It's gone through several changes in things, and fundamentally, back, believe it or not, as far ago as April 1990, that's when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister, we signed the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. And that began to change everything, and it's changed our laws. We ratified it, by the way, under John Major, but what came in was things like the Education Reform Act in 1988, and then the Education Act in 1992. And then under Tony Blair, we had the 2004 Children's Act. And that complicated the ground. So if we think we're still living the days of Joy Baker, and we're only wanting to fight the battles she fought, we're going to be on the losing side, because it's all these other things that have come in since, which have changed the mind, not just the local authority officials. Many of them still think every child ought to be in school, though some of them are more ideology driven these days. But also the law has changed, and it's now got a bias on that every child should be able to receive a suitable education, which is guaranteed by the state. And it's that last bit that we're really struggling with, because with the new draft guidance, with calls for registers and so on, people are looking and they're wanting to have this situation where the state can turn around to other countries and say, we guarantee every child receives an education. What Joy represents is the traditional, the long established British situation on education. And that is that parents have the leading responsibility for the education of their children. And back in her day, Joy was faced with local authority staff who said, no, you don't, we do. And if my memory is correct, they even took that to the stage of one night when she had a babysitter in, of coming along and kidnapping children and putting them in a children's home. And Joy Baker was fighting against that notion that the state has the ultimate authority over children. And yet, both human rights legislation, but most importantly, British legislation talks about the fact that parents are responsible for education. And that is the battle we're still in. That is the common ground, that the state does not trust parents. It probably never has. And there is a long history of schooling being used over the centuries to hijack other people's children, notably by states. I read for the first time, I hadn't come across it, a time when the Tsar of Russia, we're going back to the 1800s, demanded that he divided Russia up into quarters, and each sector every 4 years had to provide a quota of young boys aged 7 to go into his military schools. And those boys would be in the school till they were about 18, 19, and then they would be in military service for 25 years. And that affected families. And it got to the stage where people responsible for finding those boys didn't want to send their own, so they literally sent out kidnapping gangs into other areas to kidnap boys of the right age and send them off. And that's gone on in lots of areas. The British colonial system had something of that as well, which we don't need to go into. So it's not a new problem, but it is a problem of social engineering. And this is what we're up against. Other people want your children to think like them, and in the case of the state, to think like the state wants them to think. And parents need to say, no, my responsibility is to teach my children to think in the best ways I believe is possible. And that is the real area we're dealing with here. And it's going to be a long battle, because now with the human rights stuff, that area's got more confused. And this is why today we're getting the battle over how do you define what is a suitable education? The state wants to define it in its terms. And I think we'll be allowed to home educate, but with the advance of AI and online stuff, provided we use their materials and their resources. You can teach your children at home, but what they're learning has to come from state diktat, not from parental choice. And that is where I think we share a lot of common ground with what Joy was fighting on, but we're in a different generation.
So Randall, I've got in front of me Joy's book called Children in Chancery, where she recounts the story of her many court cases and her battle with the local authorities. And this is one instance where she is cross-examining the local authority who is on the stand. So she asks him, she says, these school attendance orders served on me state that the Education Authority have decided that Yaxham School is suitable for my 4 children. Can you tell me how, in view of the fact that your committee have never seen the children, have arrived at this decision? The response from the local authority is that Yaxham School is just over a mile from Mrs. Baker's home, and it is the school which children living in that area are normally expected to attend. So she then asks, it is not then really a decision that the school is the most suitable, but that it is the nearest school. He responds, it is the school considered suitable. And then she asks, the question of considering age, ability, and aptitude is therefore pure nonsense. In fact, all the authority care about is not that the children should receive suitable education, but that they should attend the nearest school.
I think that puts it very, very well, because today, in the guidance that's been put out for consultation, in everything we hear and read, what do we find? We've got to ensure that these children are receiving a suitable education. But that's a one-sided argument. As in that quote, the local authority staff did not define what was a suitable education. They just lumped it in and assumed that any child attending school was receiving a suitable education, whether or they were or not. And to be honest and to be equitable, if the state is wanting to monitor and inspect what home educated children are being taught and see what their reading and writing ability is at various ages, they should be sending out an army of inspectors to talk to every child in school and giving them the same tests.
Yeah. Because it's not about age, aptitude, and ability at all, is it?
It's not about any of those things. It's about controlling what people learn. And this is the big difference. It was still back then, it was controlling what children learn, but now it's even stronger about that. It has grown, it has become more embedded, and we have contradictory laws. In fact, that goes back. If parents have prime responsibility, they do the choosing, but the state says we've got to police it. But they only police it for those who are outside the system. They assume that if you are attending a school, your child is receiving a suitable education. And I think the legal position is simply this. If a child is registered at a school and attending, a parent cannot be prosecuted for failing to provide them with a suitable education, whether or not the education they're receiving in that school is suitable. And that just backs up the point. It isn't about whether the education is suitable. It is about that. And there's been things in the news recently about Ofsted, and just retired Education Minister Nick Gibb, one of his last things was to appear before the Education Committee, and he basically said, because the argument being that Ofsted's grading is too blunt, being a single word, and he basically said it would confuse parents to give them more than a single word in a grading. But what does it mean? It's a broad brush. We're not looking at each child. We're saying, is the school suitable or not? And that is not the same as it being a suitable education for each child in that school. So Joy Baker turned the right stone over in that thing you read, and that is something we need to be aware of. They're not really interested in a suitable education. They're interested in an education which conforms to what they want.
Okay, so we've just been talking about this notion of suitable education and how politicians and Department for Education, they have an idea of what a suitable education is, but how much of that is actually based on stereotypes? Like, for instance, the stereotype of, well, you can only learn when you sit in a building, sit at a desk with a book in front of you or a teacher talking to you. That's what learning looks like. Or another one, it might be that, oh, if you don't go to school, you're never going to learn how to get on with other people. You're never going to. So there's a lot of stereotypes that come into informing policy and law. And it's particularly dangerous right now because we find that there's no real evidence. So the laws that they're wanting to change are not actually based on evidence. Have you got any sort of thoughts along those lines?
Well, let's start with the one that goes all the way back to Badman days, which was, for those who never know, There was a big review set off of home education in 2009 by Ed Balls from the Labour Party when he was Secretary of State for Children, Schools and Families, that started the real political onslaught on. And many times government ministers or MPs would stand up and say things like, the government believes that the best place for every child to learn is in school. And they never presented what research they'd done to come to that conclusion. Why? Because it's what the norm is. Everybody does it. And the biggest stereotype we get in education is normal and abnormal. And home educators do not fit in. We are abnormal. That's with Joy's trouble. And she was more abnormal than today. She was not a lone wolf, but there was not many home educators around back then. And so she was very abnormal. And if you fit in, they know how to handle you. But if you choose to be different, they don't. And so then this is when the stereotypes get magnified. A friend of mine many years ago, when we started home educating, occasionally got interviewed on the radio, and he said, I always get the question, what about socialization? Now, back then, socialization was generally taken to mean, do they know how to have friends and things? It's actually got another meaning, which I won't go into now. But his answer, he would look at them and he said, yes, I know that schools have problems with socialization. And that is the blunt fact. We've had problems in the news since lockdowns of things like everybody's welcome about the sexual abuse that goes on in school. And it's not just of peer on peer. Sometimes it's staff on pupils, and sometimes it's pupils on staff. And nobody can do anything about it because it's too big a problem for them to do. So what do? They blank it out. They don't engage with it. And this is the trouble. We have got this situation where the realities of school are blanked out from the official's mind. School is what is normal, therefore school works.
Yeah.
And they are now in a place where they're learning, because there's been a revolution over the last decade in home education. We've had different waves of people coming into home education, not as a first choice, but all of them are saying in one way or another, school is not suitable. Parents whose children have been bullied for race or for looks or things have been withdrawn. We all know that children with special educational needs do not fit these days in schools, not just because the funding isn't there, but because the rise in the percentage of the population with those needs, and schools can't cope with them. They're not going. We've had people who saw what was happening with their children during lockdowns, and that's happened. And I predicted a while back, and it's beginning to happen from what I hear, is that there's already a growing number of people who are saying, we don't want the government's views on gender and sexuality and all the nonsense that's going on teaching to our children, and there's another wave. But the state insists that what's happening in schools is suitable, and parents are voting with their feet. The easy one is, what is it all about? It is all about the same old, same old. What we've been hearing now, certainly since 2017, when Lord Soley brought in his private members bill, it's been escalating since then. It's all about how to monitor what children how children are being taught and what they're being taught. We have to distinguish it. It is not about registration directly. Registration, that fell for the moment with the schools bill last year. There's nothing in the new King's speech about it, but already MPs are asking questions in the House of Commons and in the House of Lords about when will there be a bill. We want it before the general election. That is a separate matter. That needs legislation. What this is about is monitoring and assessment. And they're saying they're using legislation about identifying children missing education to identify children receiving a suitable education, which is a bit of a strange thing to do. And they're, like they did with the 2019 guidance, they're relying heavily upon a confused picture of safeguarding. And I haven't got time to go into that, but those are the two things. But I must say, they've learned some things. The language of this guidance is much pleasanter to read than the language of the 2019. But what home educators need to realise is that while the surface of the water looks very pleasant and not that threatening, just underneath the surface, there are some very strong currents which are dangerous. And if we don't challenge those hidden currents, we will be swept down a road where we will not, where we'll be required to present ourselves and our children for regular inspections, and we will be limited in how we teach them and what we teach them. So that's where it's going. How do we do it? Well, it was launched about 3 weeks ago. The deadline for sending in submissions is the 18th of January, which seems a long way away. But we've got the Christmas holidays in between. So my suggestion is this, that parents need to try and read some of it. There's 3 documents. Pick which one you want to start with. The general introduction is 27 pages, but very quick to read because it's got all the questions in there. But read which one you want. The LA one is the longer one. Read something now. Get your mind turning it over. You need to have engaged with it before you get into the Christmas holidays. Take a week off, 2 weeks off, whatever you do over Christmas. But by the end of those holidays, you need to be ready to sit down and write. Now, there is an online form. The good news is that we have been told, Fiona Nicholson of Ed Yourself discovered this. She was the first person I knew to identify it, that there's in every section there's a free text box, and there is no limitation on how much you can put into those boxes. You're not limited to 100 or 200 or 500 words. You can write an essay in each box. So that is the place to put your thoughts if you're using the online form. Write it down beforehand. Don't try and write it on the form. I don't know if you can save it and go back to continue yet. Write it down beforehand, get it ready, cut and paste it in. So by the 18th of January, we need an overwhelming response, so much an overwhelming response that it cannot be ignored, because we all know they don't really want to hear our opinions. They just want to tick a box and say, we have consulted. Last time, guys, something was published after a consultation. There was many more home educators responded than local authorities. But the local authorities were given the precedent in the response.
Yeah.
So it's going to be hard work, but that's it.
And I want to add in there that if you represent an organization and you are able to respond as an organization, do that as well, in addition to your individual personal response. So Randall, we've just spoken about the guidance, the consultation on the draft guidance. And obviously there's a lot in there. As I said before, we need to try and respond as not only as individuals, but also as organizations, and encourage others to respond as well. But a lot of people feel like they need some help knowing how to answer the questions. And, what kinds of things, what kinds of resources are there out there, and what is available to help people in their responses?
Well, let me say, I think we all need help knowing how to respond. I'm very much at that stage, wanting to hear what other people who are active in trying to protect home education are seeing in it, how we should respond. And I'm hoping that will grow, but time is limited. So what is there? There are Facebook groups where things get discussed, but the way social media is going and the way Facebook seems to be working, it's not reliable. You need something that if you're in a group and you're using it all the time, you may see a lot more than if you're just casually watching. And I would recommend that you do something like sign up for emails. Now, it hasn't published anything yet, but the HE Byte is working on it. They've got an email list you can sign up on. That's the he-byte.uk, and they will be commenting on it. They're also reporting on what other people are saying. And I'm sure there's other means, but I would say get plugged in, make sure you're talking about it with others. If you're in a Facebook group and they don't talk about the political thing, I'd like to suggest you find one that is.
Can I suggest the Home Education Action Group?
Yeah.
As I think that the Home Education Action Group will be sure to share things that have been put out.
Yeah. So there are these places where you can get things, but on the HE Byte website, if you want to know where to find the consultation things, they've got an English consultation page. They've got a timer giving you the time, how long we've got to respond. If you click on that, it will take you directly to that page, and there are all the links to the documents. And I'm sure they will go somewhere on the Joy Baker page to give you the links to those documents. Those are what you need to be reading. As I say, there's 3 documents. If you're new to home education, start asking around. Ask a bit about the background. This is, as I say, started in 2009, took a pause till about 2015, but since 2015, it's been building up, and we're now to a really serious moment. So try and read short things and look out for what other people are saying, but talk with it as well with other home educators. We're all exhausted. We all wish it would go away, but you only need to see the reaction to there being no bill on registration in the King's Speech to see this isn't going to go away until it is properly put to bed. It's not going to be kicked into the long grass like Badman's proposals were.
Yeah. I have another suggestion, is also to go and read up on the Convention of Human Rights and compare what that says with what the guidance is suggesting. And if you think that if you think that in any way your rights are being breached through the guidance, you need to bring that into your response as well, I would say.
Well, on that, the big areas the guidance doesn't handle is data protection and the right to privacy. And the right to privacy is not just in the international human rights law, it's in the British Human Rights Act. And we do have a right to privacy. And that is the biggest worry to me, that what's going on is we are losing privacy, and there's nothing really in the consultation that tells the local authority what data they can collect and what they can do with it once they've collected it. And that is an area where I'd encourage people to think really seriously about.
So Randall, we know that we're dealing with a lot of challenges as home educators, and we're constantly wanting to change the law, change the guidance, and that kind of thing. And we also spoke earlier about some of the stereotypes. What are some of the things we could be doing within our local communities and our local, maybe locally and nationally? Perhaps you've got some ideas on changing attitudes, changing people's minds.
Well, Jerry, I think one of the things we fail to appreciate, arguments like this, because they're held in Westminster, if you're in Wales, in the Senate, they're done centrally through central government. We always think it's the MPs, but there's actually a better way to the MPs than through writing to them direct. We've all got a local council. Now, they may not be the right party or whatever, but they get influenced from other politically motivated people against home education. But most of them are actually just ordinary people. Local councillors are effectively your local neighbours. Now, they may not want to engage over home education. There's a very simple reason. They've got big problems running councils, and they've got big budget items and areas where they're really terrified of getting it wrong, such as in safeguarding children, in homes, in care, and in schools. And they've got all these big things, and we are just a tiny percentage. But you cannot change. We, as you can tell, our children aren't at home anymore. They're all adults, and they've got children of their own. But in 2016, I think it was, we discovered that in the area where we live, a lot of the families were getting hassle from the local council. And we decided, we knew our local councillor, we asked her if we could meet her and talk to her about home education. We met with her, we told her what the problem was, that the local council had a really bad published policy, and it was even overstepping the mark on that. She arranged for us to meet with two key councillors, central councillors, chair of the portfolio holder for children and young people, and the chair of the scrutiny committee for that area as well. They brought along on the first meeting a couple of staff members, which they didn't tell us about, but that was all right. We were prepared. And we had a long meeting with them, set out the problems. 12 months later, nothing had happened. So we went back to the councillor, and we had a meeting with the same post holders, but different people. There'd been a change in the council. We met two other people and no staff on this time. And that seems to have gone a lot better, because several months later, with a bit of hiccups along the way, they published a new policy for the county council. And where it was 1 out of 10 for accuracy and such like, it's about 9 out of 10. And that made a difference. Now, I think that's under threat through what's been in the last guidance and proposed in the next one, but you can do it. But there's another thing that's useful that I've learned along the way. When MPs come back to their constituency, they may see you or other constituents once every blue moon. However, they regularly meet with their councillors, and they get feedback from their councillors, which also means that even if you have got a councillor who isn't the same party as your MP, you might be able to talk to somebody in their constituency party and talk to them about the issue, and that will get fed back to your MP. And if we can get councillors asking the right questions of themselves, of their officials, and of their members of parliament, that will change the conversation far more than writing endless stoppy letters to an MP who will just file it in the "I've heard from this person too much" box.
Yeah, I wanted to add there as well that I've personally worked within our local authority with our home education officer by just going and meeting with them and helping them to understand our perspective as home educators, emphasizing the need for mutual trust and respect in our dealings with one another, and making sure that they were kind of understanding who we were, and that did a great deal to change how things work in our local authority. And that's had almost a trickle up effect, where so those local authority officers, because they've got a positive relationship with home educators, that's being reported up the line and not being seen as a problem area. So I think there's a lot to be said for just really identifying who the people are you need to target to speak to.